All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining Dr. Lynn or Dr. Kiesling and I tonight. Dr. Kiesling is a visiting professor in the Department of Engineering and Public Policy at Carnegie Mellon University. She is also the co-director of the Institute for Regulatory Law and Economics at Carnegie Mellon, as well as an affiliate with the Walter E. Scott Institute for Energy Innovation. Her research focuses on grid modernization, and through the lens of transaction cost economics, her work examines regulations and market design in the development of smart grid technology. She is the author of 25 peer-reviewed articles, 20 book chapters, the co-editor of 2 volumes, and has testified or submitted expert testimony to regulatory commissions at both the federal and state levels 8 times since 2004. She also, and I know she doesn't know I'm going to say this, but she also has a really, really cool history of economic thought channel on Vimeo that I have actually watched several times over. So a non-zero percentage of your total views is strictly from me on various devices. So Dr. Kiesling, thank you so much for both making those videos and for being here with us tonight. It's a true pleasure.
Oh, thank you. And I'm glad you like the history of thought stuff. Funny story on that. I have an old electricity work acquaintance who I used to do a bunch of work with in the mid 2000s. And I get this random email from him like 2 weeks ago. And he's like, I want to talk to you about Leon Walras. Let's talk. And I'm like, Walras? Why do you want to talk to me about Walras? And so then it turns out he's doing some stuff for a project, but that he went to Google to search for some stuff about Walras, and my video popped up first. And so he's convinced that the internet is spying on him and sending him links to people he knows. But anyway, thank you for having me, and hi, hello to all of you out there. I wish I could be there in person. Hopefully next year we will get to do things like this in person. Yay. I'm going to try to keep my remarks fairly brief and explain what is this smart grid stuff that I work on. But in particular, I want to focus on the connection of energy technologies and regulation, and what do we have to look forward to in the future. And I'm going to talk, there we go. I'm going to try to motivate this with the extent to which technology is really changing. And I think a big theme of my work and of my comments to y'all tonight is that for the past 100 years, technology in electricity has not been changing that fast. But over the past decade, technology in energy has been changing very, very quickly. And so we have this mismatch because the business model of regulated utilities, the regulatory model, all of those were developed for and are based on the idea of a particular type of technology and a particular business setup. And that's just not going to be the way it's going to happen in the future. And so we have to sort through this institutional and technological and economic mismatch. And so exactly how are these things changing? Solar photovoltaic on rooftops is a great example, and it's one that we see increasingly more and more. Even up here in Illinois and Michigan, there's some economics to having solar. You don't have to be in Arizona for it to make economic sense, because the costs of producing things like rooftop solar, like wind turbines, and increasingly battery storage, those costs are falling really dramatically and very quickly. And so that's the big change we're seeing. The other big change that we're seeing is digitization. I've taken to calling digitization the underappreciated clean energy technology. And that's where the smart grid stuff comes in. So I'll talk about that in a bit. But what we're also, because of this combination of distributed energy resources like solar and wind and storage, And that combined with digitization means that we can have more automation, we can have more engagement of consumers. Most people, you know, when you think about electricity, you think, I just need to charge my phone, or I want to flip the switch and the light goes on. But with a few tweaks and a few new products and services that will change operations and change features, you can actually get all of the convenience and the services and the comfort, you know, the hot cup of coffee, the hot shower, the charged phone. You can get all of that with less energy consumption and less environmental impact. And for me, that's a win-win because it's aligning economic and environmental incentives. Um, so let's dig into that. And first I'll start by setting up what the traditional power grid and how it's structured. And it has served us really well for over a century. The origins of this industry are in the 1880s. But at this point, we have a lot of big built infrastructure, and it's built to operate differently and to do different things with different types of energy resources than what we're likely to be having in the future. And so at some level, and this schematic here shows you what, you know, basically what the physical supply chain looks like. Traditionally, you've had these large scale power plants. And when I say large, I mean large. And they will generate electricity, push current out onto very high voltage transmission. And those are those tall towers that you see when you're out driving around or riding your bike, as that's when I usually see them. And so that gets transmitted over long distances. And then those wires go through substations to take that high voltage current and change it to a lower voltage current to go onto the distribution wires that come into our homes, our factories, the shops where we shop. Right? And so that's what the supply chain looks like. But this is a 100-year-old architecture, 100-year-old design, and it's designed for a particular types of technologies, and that's really not what we have anymore. It's not what we're going to have in the future. Thematically, this is very reminiscent of the telecom networks in the 1990s and some of the strains that when we had mobile telephony really picking up, that the strains that put on the network. So the one big question that those of us who work on these issues ask is, can we improve reliability and efficiency simultaneously with increasing innovation and investment? And that sounds like a lot, but I think the answer is yes. And here's how. The other question that I want to tackle, because I'm sure y'all are curious about this, is can we do this with both reliability and resilience in the face of unknown and changing environmental conditions, with the example being the Texas blackouts in mid-February. So I'm going to give a little background on what happened in Texas. I'll start with a little bit of historical context, and then I'll go through, this is a slide that I used in a presentation about a month ago. So, so that's not last week, it should say last month, although now it's April, so it should say February. The Texas thing kind of has made time into a very flat circle, and my life has just been very hectic. And then after we talk about Texas for a little bit, I'll talk about some of the technologies and market designs that I think will be useful as we look into the future. And I think those are very economically informed. So the economics of them is really important. So that synthesis of technology and economics, which is the area that I work in that I'm not going to define yet, but is called Transactive Energy. So, and Dave, you'll tell me if there are clarifying questions, right? If any of y'all have clarifying questions, things that you want to ask while I'm talking, feel free. And I'm going to try and keep this brief so that we can have a more interactive back and forth. All right. So a little bit of historical background on the electricity industry. This is the powerhouse underneath Niagara Falls. And each one of these is basically a turbine. And the way you generate electricity is, you have all of that work, all of that force of that water coming over the falls. And you can harness that water to make it basically move these turbines. And you put the turbine inside, there's a magnetized, the way it turns, it's magnetized, and it basically throws off electrons. It creates a current. I'm not an engineer, I'm an economist. I should have said that, even though I'm in an engineering department at the moment. So these are the turbines, and these were invented in the 1890s by Nikola Tesla. And there's, I think, 24 of them underneath Niagara Falls. So what I'd like you to draw your attention to is look at this gentleman who is standing next to this front turbine, and assume he's about the average height of a man in 1895 when these were installed. So he's probably like 5'9". I think the technical term for these mechanical technologies, these turbines, is that they're huge. They are enormous. They are bigger than any other mechanical manufacturing machinery had ever been. And they could power thousands of homes, which was unheard of in the 1890s. And so this is one of the most important origins of this industry, is that the technological origins of electricity are in these big technologies. So, big turbines, high voltage, high capacity, high voltage transmission wires to carry the current long distances. And so this is a concept in economics that we call economies of scale. These technologies created a world in which you could get electricity, and electricity was a hot commodity. And it was for electric lighting was the hot commodity in the 1890s. And so they could light thousands and thousands of homes at the lowest average cost per unit of output. So that's the idea of economies of scale, is low average cost by having one provider do it. And so in cities like Chicago and New York, in the early years, in the 1890s and through like 1905, you would have, say, a dozen or so competing electric companies, and they would all put up their own poles and wires. They would all build their own huge generators. But then they would, through rivalrous competition, they would compete price down to below average cost, because they're spending so much on capital to build these systems. And this is very much a systems industry. And that way of thinking about this as a system, all the way from the generator to the lighting fixture inside your home, is due to Thomas Edison, right? Thomas Edison, his vision was for the electric system to be fully integrated and to have this vertical integration along the entire supply chain, even into the lighting fixture in your home. So this is an industry that's born of technological change, the race to the patent office between Edison and his competitors, idea of economies of scale. And so there's a lot of really cool, interesting technology history in the late 19th century here. There's another aspect of the history here that's very important, and this is an economic concept called economies of scope. So what would happen, and this, for example, here in Chicago, Sam Insel was the head of Commonwealth Edison, and he was building these big generation power plants and building out the wires network, and also acquiring the wires network of his rivals when his rivals couldn't, had to exit the industry because their costs weren't as low as his. And so he knew that the Chicago Transit Authority, the CTA, was looking to electrify the subway, the elevated train. Actually, at that point, it wasn't subway yet. And the way municipal train systems would electrify those in those days is that a lot of them would just build their own generators. Insel looked around, he's remember selling electric lighting. And so he kind of looked around and he's like, you know what? I've got this generation system that's sitting idle when it's light out because people don't need it for lighting. People want the lighting at night. During the day, a lot of people take the train. So he goes to the CTA and he cuts them a deal. And he says, don't build your own generator. I'll sell you electricity from my generators and I'll give you a good deal. And they did. And so that's the idea of economies of scope, where you use the same assets, the same capital to produce different products. And in this case, it's time differentiated products, right? Trains during the day, lighting at night. I mentioned the consolidation already. And I love this newspaper cartoon, and these are the quote unquote robber barons who are looking to Jack and the Wall Street Giants, and someone to come and take down the Wall Street Giants, because the Wall Street Giants are, of course, too big and take advantage of the little guy, right? This is the 1890s. This is the period in America of the progressive era. And the concern that these big companies that had these big technologies, that they would just be too big to be good for the regular consumer, and that they would have market power and be able to charge high prices or restrict the output that they sell, and take advantage of consumers. And so progressives wanted to municipalize or have cities own electric utilities, and there are quite a few municipal utilities in the US. But what we have predominantly in the US is investor-owned utilities, right? Private entities. And this comes about as a political bargain, because you have the historical emergence of this as a private industry, but then state level public utility regulation becomes a political compromise between the progressives who want municipalization and the industry that wants to stay private, but they're willing to accept rate of return regulation as a political bargain, with the condition that they get a government granted monopoly in their physical service territory, right? So ComEd serves Chicago, and once they're a regulated utility, there's a legal entry barrier and no one else can come in and compete against them. They're the only ones who are legally allowed to generate, transmit, and distribute electricity. Yeah. And so that leads to these state public utility commissions. The regulators are established at the state level, and starting in 1907 in Wisconsin and New York, and then it soon follows in the other states. And that those state PUCs have jurisdiction over the stuff on the right hand of this graphic, which is the distribution system, the retail sales to end use, residential, commercial, and industrial customers. So homes, offices, and factories. But increasingly, as kind of a backup, starting in the 1920s, utilities would have contractual agreements with each other as kind of emergency backup. So, hey, if I have a plant that goes down, can I call you up and say, hey, I need 100 megawatts at 3 o'clock? Can you sell me that? And that was going on quite a bit, and a lot of those cross state lines. And so part of the 1930s New Deal, the Federal Power Act, created federal jurisdiction to regulate any of those transactions that cross state lines, to ensure that the prices for those transactions were, quote unquote, just and reasonable. Right? So we have this split in how electricity is regulated in the US, and that's different here from other places. Most other places just don't have that kind of federal state jurisdiction split the way we do. Okay, so let's take some of this background and apply it to what happened in February in Texas. There's Texas, and I should say that in the US, those transmission networks, there's basically three big transmission networks in the country that are just interconnected with themselves and not very interconnected with each other. There's what's called the Eastern Interconnect, which basically goes from the East Coast to somewhere in the plains, almost to Colorado. There's the Western Interconnect that goes from the West Coast inland, and then there's Texas. And so Texas has its own transmission interconnection, and that network is managed by an entity called the Electricity Reliability Council of Texas, or ERCOT. And so what they do is they coordinate all of the physical, right? Because you have to coordinate electricity physically in real time when you don't have a lot of storage, right? It's not like natural gas where you can, or like oil or gasoline, where you can just stick a bunch of it in a tank and wait until the price goes up or until it's needed. Electricity, you need to balance supply and demand in real time. And I'm kind of bouncing my hands like this because electricity is an alternating current, so it goes as a sine wave. And so it's kind of constantly doing this 60 times a second. That's what's called frequency. And so ERCOT is managing all of this physical stuff, and they're also managing the market layer. In Texas, Texas is the most deregulated electricity market in the country, and one of the most deregulated in the world. And ERCOT's role is not just to manage the physical operations of the grid, but also to manage the wholesale power market. And in the wholesale power market, what happens is that the retail service providers, the people who people in Texas buy their power from, they go into the wholesale power market to buy power from generators. So the generators are the sellers and the retailers are the buyers. It's also important to note that a lot of transactions in this industry are what are called bilateral transactions. So they agree to long-term contracts. And in these organized wholesale power markets, that's essentially like a financial spot market. It's a place to do kind of last minute procurement. But a lot of the demand is fulfilled, and a lot of the energy that gets delivered is through these long-term contracts. So I put this slide up here just to reinforce the fact that ERCOT has this responsibility for keeping the grid reliable, right? They are the reliability entity. And those are the things that historically through the 20th century we've wanted out of the electric power system. The policy objectives have been for electricity to be safe, affordable, and reliable. And all of that is on ERCOT's plate, in addition to the fact that they manage the market platform. And the market platform has, like a day ahead energy market, an hour ahead energy market, a 15-minute energy market. They have markets for what are called ancillary services, which is engineering stuff that has to happen in order to keep that frequency in the supply and demand balance. And they also do the kind of back office administration of the retail market in Texas. Texas has a very thriving retail market, the most thriving retail market in the country. Lots of different types of products and services available, and ERCOT helps them process all of that. Okay, so that's just some institutional background. Now let's cast our minds back to February when it was cold, and it was unusually cold in Texas. Texas gets winter storms that are particularly ice storms. Once in a while, they'll probably get like one a year, and the local municipalities will have bought a pile of salt to put on the roads, and once you've used up that pile of salt, they're done. In this case, Texas had a series of storms, 3 of them in particular, that were way colder than usual for way longer than usual. And so in the first storm on the 11th and 12th, a lot of places used up their salt pile. And so the roads became impassable very quickly. This was also a large set of storms. It basically covered the entire state. And one of the other things that ERCOT does as the grid operator and the market platform operator is that they do long range planning, and that includes weather forecasts. And so this weather system that went on for a week with these successive, very cold, steadily cold storms was well beyond what they had forecast. And it's the worst storm in at least 20 years. There was a bad storm in 1989 that was probably about this bad. There was a storm in 2011 that was less bad, but still prompted a regulatory review of, you know, why were there so many outages, and, you know, here are some changes that need to be made. And some of those changes were made and some weren't. And so what's going on, this graphic is great. It kind of captures everything. The gray line at the top is the first thing I want to draw your attention to. And this is the forecast of demand, or load is the word that they use for demand. So demand is forecast here to be pretty high, and this is really high. Especially for the winter, right? Because Texas is a summer peaking place. They're used to 100-degree summer temperatures, and that's what they've built their electric system to deal with. This kind of, you know, single-digit temperature for days on end cold is not what they built their network to deal with, but that's what they had. And so you get high demand here, and a high forecast demand, and it's a combination of two things. One, demand from homes that have electric heating, and so because it's cold, they want to keep cranking the heat. And number two, demand for electricity. Actually, I take that back. I'm thinking about gas, not electric. But so there's a big demand for electricity because of electric heating, but that's beyond what the generators are able to deliver. And so what starts to happen at 1:30 in the morning, Sunday night of the 14th, 15th, is that this demand supply balance, that frequency, starts to go out of balance. And it's what's called a frequency drop. When you have a lot of demand and not enough supply to meet it, the frequency drops. And that can be really, really disastrous. And if ERCOT let the frequency drop happen, then that would have triggered a widespread outage across the whole system, and would probably have taken weeks to recover from. So you say, okay, that sounds terrible. What caused this? That's where we want to go down and look at the red and the blue here. The red indicates the thermal plant outages. Thermal plants are natural gas, coal, and nuclear plants. And that there are quite a few outages, but then they begin to trip offline for safety as they see this frequency drop. So you have a lot of outages, and then the outages. So what happens here on the 15th is that ERCOT implements rolling blackouts. So they try to do these controlled rolling outages rather than have a system-wide outage. And they roll those for 3 days. And as plants return from outages, then the actual load starts to get closer to forecast, and the outages end, you know, the 18th. At the bottom in the blue is the production of wind and solar. And wind and solar are an important part of the story in Texas. Texas is very windy, and Texas is one of the pioneers of wind power because it is so windy that it's really economical to build and use wind power in Texas. And as I said at the beginning, costs have been falling so much that that's even true if you don't take account of the fact that wind gets a little subsidy. It gets a production tax credit. That production tax credit has been falling over the past decade, but it does still get it. But what's really driving investment in wind in Texas is a market that's got low barriers to entry and is conducive to investment. And all of this wind and the declining production cost for wind turbines. So wind and solar, you can't just flip a switch and turn them on and off, right? And they're what's called intermittent resources. But the long-term forecast that ERCOT does takes that into account. And so we know, okay, wind and solar are only going to show up this amount of the time, and they're only going to produce this amount of power. And this dashed line is ERCOT's plan, right? That's what they expect the wind and solar to bring to the party. And you can see that there are a few hours on the 15th and 17th where wind and solar underperformed that plan, but there are also some hours where they overperformed. Okay, so far this sounds like it was a mess, and it was a mess. You know, over 100 people died, which is tragic. So what actually is going on here? And I think one thing I would like to encourage you to think about is to avoid monocausal explanations. This is a complex system, and it's even more so, it's a set of interdependent complex systems. And when complex systems fail, they fail in complex ways. So for example, one of the main fuels that's used to generate electricity in the US, but especially in Texas, is natural gas. Natural gas has become cheaper over the past decade due to technological change in extraction, hydraulic fracturing or fracking. And so in Texas, they're used to just being able to, pull natural gas out of the ground. So they don't have a whole lot of storage, and they don't necessarily have a whole lot of contracts between gas suppliers and power plants for what we call firm commitments to deliver gas. And so what happened with these freezes, because they were so persistent, is that at the gas wellhead, at the extraction site, a lot of the mechanical parts of the wellhead froze. And so, getting the gas from the wellhead to the power plant, or if you're a homeowner and you have gas heat, from the wellhead to the burner tip of your furnace, that gas was in much less supply than usual because of upstream freezing. And so there were power plants that were ready and able to produce electricity, but they could not get access to sufficient gas supply to actually run. And so that's an important part of the story, is that getting the gas to the power plants, and both the physical delivery and the contractual relationships that they had just were not up to this kind of large, catastrophic weather event. I mentioned wind in particular because you did see a lot of very, I would say, politicized commentary from the get-go about, see what happens when you invest in these unreliable intermittent resources. And I think we can see from the evidence, and now 6 weeks hence, that our initial conclusion was borne out, that it's really not a failure of wind to show up. Wind did fail, but the gas power plants failed harder and longer and more. And so again, this is not a monocausal explanation. We even had in Texas, they've got 4 nuclear reactors at 2 different plants. One of the 4 reactors went offline because it had a safety sensor in its cooling pond, and the cooling pond froze, and that tripped the safety sensor. Even though the plant was fine, the reactor was fine, it could have generated perfectly fine, but because that sensor was in the pond and it froze, it took that reactor offline. And then some of the other comments that you heard a lot was, well, this is a failure of deregulation, this is a failure of markets. And I think that's not entirely true either, that there are some improvements that ERCOT could make in the institutional framework, in the rules that they use to operate their markets. But and there were some decisions that ERCOT and the regulator, the Public Utilities Commission, made that in hindsight have seemed to be ill-advised and are probably going to get legally challenged, and the lawsuits are going to go on for years. But in general, the markets in Texas are very much set up to give generators the best possible incentives to perform, to generate when they can. And they were sitting there, they were ready. So I think all of these factors contributed to the magnitude and the tragedy of the event. But that if you're looking for a primary proximate cause, I think we're looking at this kind of upstream natural gas supply and its reliability as part of a big part of the story. So I hope that helps give you some understanding that in what has happened in Texas, because we have to be concerned about seeing these kind of issues in other systems and other states. But the issues are really energy system issues, the integration of the upstream natural gas supply, plus the unusual electricity demand for heating. The other part of the story, and this is where I'm going to focus going forward, is that there are some mechanisms for reducing demand, but they're not widespread enough, and they just weren't enough to counteract the decrease in supply. Another big question is weatherization. There was some weatherization of power plants after the 2011 cold, but this was a really bad event. And also, when you're in a system that mostly has 100-degree heat, weatherizing for cold and weatherizing for heat kind of run counter to each other. In the summer, you want ventilation, and in the winter, you want enclosure. And if you try to do one and not the other, then you have costs. But if you try to do both, then you increase the cost of doing each. So there's some weatherization design innovation that's going to have to happen here. And so I think one important question to ask here is, what is the prudent investment to insure against harms that only happen once every 20 years? And I think that's the economic question, and thinking of it as like an insurance question. And that's pretty much where I think things are at the moment. So I think where do we go from here? I'm gonna, there's a whole bunch of things that I've just kind of alluded to. I want to, in our last few minutes, focus on the last bullet there of some changes that could mitigate future harms. And the other ones I've already referred to. Another one that I haven't mentioned that's important is there are a lot of people who are living in very poorly insulated buildings. Right? Energy efficiency is very low in a lot of residential housing stock in Texas, and especially true for people who are low income. And so I think focusing on, and especially if we talk about what could be the role of government here, that doing some kind of targeted focus on energy efficiency in low income residential housing would probably at least attenuate some of the more human parts of the tragedy. But I want to focus at a higher level on the digitization and DERs that I mentioned before. And this gets us into this smart grid question. So if we take that idea that we've had of the past 100+ years, of a very mechanical grid, that supply chain that I showed before, from generation to transmission to distribution to the home or the factory or the office, now take that physical electric grid and overlay on top of it a digital communication network. And that's what a smart grid is. A smart grid is when you integrate digital sensing and communication and automation capabilities into the electric power network. And smart meters are a part of that story. Smart appliances, being able to manage your appliances from your phone. I have a thermostat here on my wall that I was driving back from Colorado on Sunday, and I turned on my app, and I increased the heat temperature here from, I think I was in Des Moines when I did that. So that's the kind of stuff we're talking about. Then there are also different technologies within the grid that can help automate and digitize the operations of the network. And so I think that's part of it. Another part is smart pricing. And that's where I want to take us, especially in light of the kind of technological changes we're seeing with storage, these batteries, you can have a Tesla Powerwall in your garage, and basically what you can do is you could draw, if you were in the blackout, you could draw power from your Tesla battery, from your car even, during the blackout. And so that kind of capability gives you this resilience, not just the reliability of being able to flip the switch and the light goes on, but the resilience of being able to rebound back from some kind of unfortunate event. There's a kind of poster child of this in electricity, and it's in California, where, and for kind of obvious reasons, this is called the duck curve. As in California, as more and more rooftop solar has been installed, and more people can basically sell back their excess energy beyond what they're using in their own homes, in the middle of the day, right, from noon to say 5 o'clock, you get all of that solar coming online. And so the electricity supply that's required from the other, the traditional natural gas or hydroelectric generation falls in the afternoon because all that solar is coming on. And then at 7, 8 o'clock, when the sun goes down, those resources have to come on, and they have to come on fast. And that's really expensive. And so as an example, a case study to think about this digitization, one example of a way you could deal with that is what I like to think of as coordinating PV and EV charging. So here you have your electric vehicle, and this could be in your home or it could be at a charging station. But suppose that your vehicle's plugged in and that you have it set up on where you have a trigger price. So you say, okay, when the price goes below X, charge my car. Well, if you think about what's going on with the supply curve when these solar panels come on at 2, 3, 4 in the afternoon, what's happening if you have those solar panels and those electric vehicles together on a local energy market? When those solar panels are producing, they're shifting out that supply curve. So increasing supply, increasing supply, increasing supply. And as that happens, the market equilibrium price is falling. At some point, the market price is going to fall below the trigger price for people who want to charge electric vehicles. And different people are going to have different trigger prices because they have different preferences. So rather than having this, this kind of belly of the duck, you could have the EV electric vehicles charging in the middle of the afternoon, taking up that solar production. And then, this duck would be a lot skinnier, and you wouldn't have to do so many resources coming on and doing that huge ramp up at 7 and 8 at night. But the way I've just described that is by using what we call transactive energy or price-based dispatch. And in transactive energy, what you do is you use price signals to do that physical coordination. And it's all automated, right? So the way I just described that, you've programmed in your EV so that when the price goes below your trigger price, that battery in your car is just going to start charging automatically, and you'll pay for what you use. And so that's the idea of price-based dispatch and automated response. Notice with an EV, because it's a battery, it's storage too, that you could sell the generation that's stored in your battery. So you could set a trigger price for buying, but you could set a trigger price for selling. Say, okay, when the price goes above this other price, discharge my battery. If I'm not planning to drive anywhere, discharge my battery. And then you can make some money and help pay off your car payment and your Tesla Powerwall. So we're doing, my co-authors and I are doing a big project on this with a electric utility co-op in Colorado. And what we're doing is we're helping them to coordinate the production from the solar panels and sending some signals and using price signals and basically testing out this idea of price-based dispatch and automated response. But the idea, the fundamental, and this is a great point to leave at, because I think then we can talk about the economics for the last few minutes. The underlying idea of this price-based dispatch is entirely just economics. That you can, that the fundamental economic problem in economic systems is, of course, the coordination of the desires and the actions of all of these people who are in the market and they don't know each other. And so you have all these people who have solar PV on the roof, have an electric vehicle in the garage, and maybe they don't know each other, but they could benefit from transacting with each other. And so transactive energy, the idea is to use price-based dispatch to enable these people to transact with each other. And they're still, they're still using the utility wires network, but that they can at least buy and sell the energy with each other. And I think the final economics point I will say here is that this takes crucial impetus from the fact that digital technologies are transaction cost reducers. So, so for those of you who are fans of Ronald Coase and thinking about transaction costs, as I am, digitization has reduced transaction costs in the whole economy, from Amazon to Zillow, and it will reduce transaction costs in the electric system if we let it. So thank you. I've talked longer than I meant to, but I hope we can have a good conversation now. I'm going to unshare